Record.
Hello everybody and welcome again to another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. I've been particularly looking forward to this show because for many years I've been fascinated by the phenomenon known as synchronicity. Now those of you who know my work will know that I have a slightly subtler version of this which I call synchronicity, which is that these are coincidences that seem to have significance in a positive way. During the show today, I'll probably be touching on some of these. But the person we have with us today is we're very fortunate to have with us Alan Abadessa Green. And Alan and I have worked together, or Alan was very kindly invited me to submit a chapter to his Sync Book 2, which is a collection of essays written by various individuals from across the world who are interested in the phenomena of synchronicity. Now, I know that synchronicity is of profound interest to many people, and Alan is one of the world's experts on the subject, so I'm delighted to have him join us today. So without further ado, Alan, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and such like, so we can have a little bit of an idea of who you are, where you live, and what your interests are?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor to be with you today. So I probably started down this road. I mean, throughout my life, we've all, I think, had these meaningful coincidences. We've all had events that made us question the nature of reality, or I think most of us have. So this is just a more applied version of that question and the research that I've been doing probably my whole life. But I would say a few years back, I don't know, I guess after 9/11, I'm born and raised in New York City. After 9/11, that was an event that certainly impacted me and the people around me. And as I got more into that event and all the different conspiracy theories that came up around it, that was an area that captured my attention for a while. And what happened was people started talking about all these coincidences within the event of 9/11 as evidence of a conspiracy. And as I followed their logic a little bit further, I mean, I'm open to many of those things. Political corruption to me is very real, as we see in the world around us. But a lot of what people were calling evidence of intent, to me, seemed like synchronicity, seemed like there was a pattern there that we can find in just about everything, or there are elements of, say, numerology or certain archetypal language that is being expressed. And to me, that became much more interesting, or almost much more important for me to understand that angle before I could start saying, where did human intent stop and start? I had to understand the phenomenon that was also at play there. So my research made a complete divergent path down to studying symbolism, how archetypes express themselves in nature. I would say we could see this in, say, even in nature, how we see the Fibonacci sequence in lightning bolts and sunflower heads and things like that. When we see these things, we don't call that evidence of a conspiracy. We say this is sort of the fingerprint of, if we want to call that God, or how the universe unfolds, or the matrix-like nature of reality, or the Bohmian IMAX, whatever terms are familiar with people listening, something like that. To me, if we saw that Fibonacci sequence in a sunflower, we don't say, that's evidence of the Illuminati. We say, this is nature. Well, just the same way, when we see certain things that show up in every event, and I mean literally you waking up this morning, having a cup of coffee and using the restroom, those same archetypes were expressed in the most simple and everyday activity. And yet we see those, we only really pay attention to the grand events. And it's so easy to notice it in the grand events that we assume this is something more. I don't know if that at least kind of gets the ball rolling as to where I start to take this and how I focus in on certain things. And what I really want to show people is, if you can start to realize how these archetypes are expressed in the everyday, in the every moment, this gives us clues as to how synchronicity works, how time is structured, how reality is structured, and how consciousness is playing a role of both creator and created along with this Bohmian IMAX or this matrix or whatever terms suit you best.
You use the term archetypes. Now, I'm sure there are members of the audience that know the term, and there's probably quite a few of them who know exactly what we mean by archetypes. Can you tell us a little bit about, within synchronicity, how the archetypes manifest and exactly what you mean by the term used within the overall definition of synchronicity?
Sure. This was, if you follow Carl Jung's work, obviously the guy who coined the term synchronicity, he starts to take in all this extra stuff. And I think if one objectively looks at his developing ideas of synchronicity, it becomes this sort of hodgepodge. It starts off as meaningful coincidences, and then it becomes this strange hodgepodge of paranormal activity, psychic activity. It's always funny to me to read him, and he goes, well, I think this is related to synchronicity. And he doesn't really explain why, but I would agree 100%. These are absolutely connected. Synchronicity, when we talk about a meaningful coincidence, it's usually, hey, what's the classic example? I'm thinking about this friend that I haven't seen in forever, and then my phone rings, and that's who's calling me. So we can say synchronicity is an expression or a meeting of the inner state and the outer state, your inner thoughts and emotions thinking about your friend as expressed in the external world as the phone call or meeting this person on the street. So this is why it literally has to do with time, but it also has to do with mental states and external worlds. Now, very often what we can use to understand that this is happening more often than we think, when we say, oh, I was thinking about my friend and he called, this is a very in-your-face example. But when you start to understand archetypes, and by this we can think of classic mythology or classic narratives, and I really do want to get into more of what this means, these classic narratives, but even Carl Jung got into things like the Tarot or Kabbalah. So if someone can picture in their mind tarot cards, and get out of your mind all the sort of implied New Age associations that might leap to mind. I want you to just think of it as a collection or a catalog of archetypes, the same way we might look at the periodic table of elements, and we can say the universe is made up of these elements. Well, much the same way, we can look at a catalog of sometimes we're expressing, so like Freud might say, oh, this person has an Oedipus complex. Well, what does that really mean? It means they're playing out the story of Oedipus. So they are taking on the role of that archetype. So this is the kind of examples that I feel like will kind of put things into perspective. You're playing out a role, whether consciously or unconsciously, and these roles, these stories repeat over and over and over through time. And when sometimes you're playing out one archetype and you see that same archetype being expressed in the world around you, this is a synchronicity, but it's one that so often goes unnoticed because we haven't become familiar with these archetypes. And this was something that, Jung has a slightly different take on it, but he continued to study these different esoteric systems. And I believe the real reason for that is that when we look at Kabbalah, the Kabbalah has something they call the four worlds. All right, and I'll just you have the world of archetypes where all begins to be something. Then you have the world where creation takes place. You have the world where formation occurs, and you have the material world. So again, this is a very old idea of this sort of unmanifested, basic, elemental stew that everything emerges out of. So when we see these archetypes emerging in unison with either our thoughts or other world events, so we could watch the news and we could see someone playing out the narrative of King Arthur, and at the same time we see some major story happens in London where, oh, they're doing the Olympics at Glastonbury, which is where King Arthur is said to be. And things like that, where you see that there is this coincidence, and by coincidence we mean occurring at the same moment in time. And to me, this is super important for anyone interested in your research who wants to understand what is the nature of time.
Well, from that, of course, putting the skeptic's hat on in terms of this, Professor Richard Wiseman would argue that what is actually happening here is it's a phenomenon known as attention bias. In other words, because our mind is already triggered by something, that when something then reinforces that, we tend to make patterns, because being human beings, we are pattern seekers, so therefore we will look at patterns. And Wiseman would argue that we see one coincidence, then we will notice another, because of course at any time the human being or the human mind is taking in so much information that we will select certain information within certain patterns. And of course from that he'll move on to something called confirmation bias, which is what I was intrigued when you were saying there about the old Arthurian legend and the way in which you'll see patterns within Arthurian legend, and you'll see Cornwall and everything else, which would be confirmation bias, because what is actually happening is you're actively looking for the links, and of course you'll find them. So what would be your response to that general criticism?
I think there's a lot of truth in that criticism, and at the same time, it's implied that that's a bad thing. And I don't necessarily think that is a bad thing. We are pattern seekers, and this is how we, as someone who's trying to bring a little more of a scientific approach to this, what do you have to do? You have to repeat things and see if you can continue to find the same thing. So in one respect, the fact that we are seeking it out and finding it doesn't necessarily render it inappropriate. Then there's also things like, let's say, the double slit experiment, which shows that, yes, what you're looking for, you are going to find, but that means you actually had an effect on what you found, right? There is the power of the observer. So absolutely, what I've noticed over the last number of years, and everyone that I know that's researching this, there's an online community that I deal with that is studying this regularly, and every one of them, the synchronicities skyrocket once you start paying attention. There is, of course, the question of, does that mean that this is confirmation bias? Does this mean that they were always there and you just started paying attention? Or is it actually responding to the attention you place on it? Now, I don't really have a great answer for that. I think it's a little bit of all of the above. It's not to say that the criticism isn't sometimes appropriate. I would just say, you say that like it's a bad thing. This is a good thing to an extent. I mean, I want to be very careful here, because obviously there are psychological issues that can come out of this. There's the classic idea of thoughts of reference, if you know what I mean by that. There are people who have really damaged filters, mental filters, and have a hard time processing reality. At the same time, this allows us to understand a sort of unfiltered sense of reality. So if those of us who are, I would like to think of myself as a sane man, if we can kind of bring a grounded approach to this, but still explore these things and give it our attention and find out that it's still there, I don't really see an issue with that. And again, I mean, just to give the esoteric side, I'm not talking about magic or things like that. What I'm talking about is we take for granted at this point, I know if I drop something, it falls because of gravity. What was that? That's confirmation bias. I expect that when I drop something, it's going to fall to the ground. Well, if you go back to these systems like the I Ching, Kabbalah, Tarot, just as examples, this is people for hundreds of years who have been paying attention to time and how things manifest in time. And if they keep coming up with really comparable systems from different parts of the world, that anyone paying attention to time is coming up with really similar systems, systems that are essentially interchangeable, to me, there's something more to be explored there. You can't just write it off as confirmation bias. I'll give you this is probably a poor example, but there's the idea of confirmation bias. You know, if I say to you blue cars, you suddenly start noticing tons of blue cars on the road, right? Oh, because now you're seeking it out. But I remember I had just this was a few months back, and someone asked me that question, and we had this whole conversation about this idea of confirmation bias. And then I was talking to my wife. I don't know how it even came up. It was near Christmas, and it was the idea of the three magi and the sort of story of those guys. And I said, I don't know how it came up, but it was the idea of Balthazar. One of their names was Balthazar. And she goes, oh, I thought Balthazar was the name of some demon. So we look it up, and we had this whole conversation, and we look it up, and apparently there is some biblical demon named Balthazar, and there's also the biblical magi named Balthazar, and et cetera, et cetera. We finish this conversation, step outside and go to the supermarket, and the guy in line behind me is talking really loudly to his friend and says, oh, I'm working at this new restaurant called Balthazar. Now, I don't think there are as many people walking around using that obscure word as there are blue cars on the road. I didn't seek that out. Again, this is not the most profound synchronicity, but it's a pretty obscure word to hear within 5 minutes of just having the conversation. This is, again, a really small, sort of insignificant example, but things like this happen all the time. And what I have discovered is once you start paying attention, once you start interacting with it, it happens literally all the time.
I think I totally agree with you on that one, in the sense that in my book, The Labyrinth of Time, I take issue with the whole phenomenon of confirmation and attention bias, because I think sometimes you can use statistics and you can say that, for instance, they will argue in terms of precognition that if somebody precognizes a plane crash, because everybody micro dreams during the night, and each one of us will have 20 or 30 dreams a night, multiply that by 3 billion people on the planet, and you have an awful lot of dreams. Therefore, the chances are that precognitive dreams will happen again and again and again. But of course, the counter-argument to that is that precognitive dreams are specific. It's one thing dreaming about a plane crash, and it's another one dreaming about Concorde crashing in France with the back of its tail on fire, with German people on board, which is one of the cases that I deal with in my book, which actually literally happened to a friend of mine. So we have to take into account that confirmation bias and attention bias can only take us so far. And I'm reminded of my own particular case of this. And it did stun me because the research I was doing at the time was actually on synchronicity. And I needed to order a book by J.W. Dunn called Man and Time. And I went down to my local library in Horsham in West Sussex, and I put an order in for it. And because it was a comparatively rare book, it had been written in not Man and Time, sorry, it was Man and Time by J.B. Priestley. And the book had been published in 1963 or 1964. And it was a fairly rare book to get hold of, so they had to order the book from the British Library in Boston Spa in Yorkshire. The order then goes out, and around about 2 or 3 weeks later, I get a phone call from the library to say the book had arrived. I then spend another 2 or 3 days deciding which day to go into Horsham Town Centre to pick it up. I then eventually go into Horsham Town Centre, pick the book up. I then bring it back home, place it in my study, spend another 2 or 3 days doing other research before I finally, one evening, I'm on my way to bed and I pick the book up and I think, oh right, okay, I'll have a look at this. So I go to bed and I'm sifting through the pages, and it's late at night, and I'm sifting through the pages at random. There are about 300 odd pages in the book. I pick a page out on random and I start reading it. And Priestley is trying to explain time relativity, and he's having difficulty with it, so he quotes the work of a guy called Coleman, who wrote a book in, I think, about 1957 called Relativity for the Layman. And in this book, Coleman cites an example. He said, imagine that there is an explosion on the star Betelgeuse on the night of the 17th of March 2000. I read this and I turned around to my wife and I said, what year is it? And she looked at me and she said, it's 2000. You know that. And I said, yeah, what month is it? And she said, it's March. And I said, what day is it? And she said, it's the 17th of March. And I said, what time of day is it? And by this time she's getting irritated with me, and she turned around and she said, you know it's late evening. So I pointed this out and I said, what is the chances of all the dates in history and in future history that Coleman could have chosen to give that particular example? And there I was, actually reading that example, researching synchronicity on the very day that he chose for this event to take place, and indeed the time of day. Now, to me, that was significant, and to me it was evidence from somewhere that I was following the right path. You know, it was the idea that somewhere along the lines, either an earlier version of myself had lived this life before and I deliberately manifested that circumstance, or it was something far more intriguing. And of course, Camera, who was the guy that really started the whole thing going, he very much called it the law of seriality, and the idea, isn't it, that it's not just a coincidence, but it's a series of coincidences that make a coincidence a synchronicity. And I'm just interested in terms of your work, have you got any examples that you feel are so powerful that you cannot possibly use the confirmation bias or attention bias to justify it?
Absolutely, and I specifically, you wrote about that, the story you just told, you wrote about that in your chapter for Sync Book 2. And when I read that sentence, you actually say in there something to the effect of, this date, which had no personal significance for me. You make a comment that the 17th of March had no personal significance, but this seemed to be obviously the year 2000 he could have picked, but you couldn't see what the significance of March 17th was. I could find the exact quote, but I'm not going to bother. You know what I'm saying. I have a huge, undeniable synchronicity with the 17th of March. And this ties into exactly the work I'm doing right now. So when I read that, my jaw kind of dropped. First off, just a quick thing, Jake Kotze, the gentleman who coined the term synchromysticism, which really spurned this community that I'm involved with that really flourishes on the internet, he coined that term. His date of birth is March 17th. That's just a funny little thing right there. But okay, there was in 2010 when I first started getting into deeper understandings of all of this stuff. There's a gentleman by the name of Chris Knowles. He uses the expression that once you start becoming really symbol literate or start paying attention to synchronicity, it's like you're turning on some part of your brain that there's some sort of hardware that is dormant and you just flip something on. And he uses that expression, but I have to say for me it happened very literally, very forcefully. I was studying all this stuff and I started to study the story of Osiris. And we'll get into that later, but the mythological story of Osiris. Not paying attention to what time of year it was or anything. And starting around March 10th, 2010, I had this series of dreams. Every night, another variation on the same dream. And one night it was that there was some sort of giant, like, bulbous, pussy boil on my forehead, and I'm like, it's disgusting, and I'm looking in the mirror, and at some point it, like, bursts open, and there's a microchip in there, and this microchip was receiving some signal from the star Sirius. And I'm like, okay, that's really interesting. The next night I have a dream along the same lines, that there's a satellite dish, that with the apartment I was living in, there was a satellite dish from the previous tenants. I don't actually watch TV, but there was a satellite dish from the previous tenants that was still on the wall by the window by my bed. And I have this dream that Sirius is broadcasting me some sort of signal through this satellite dish into my brain. The next night I have this dream where David Bowie, dressed up like the movie Labyrinth, like he is in the movie Labyrinth, comes to me and he's like, I'm telling you, we're trying to tell you something from Sirius. And I'm like, what? Every day I'm waking up, I'm like, what the hell is going on? So finally I have, on March 16th, I have this dream, and I'm like, and in the dream I kind of have this lucid dream moment, and I go, okay, if you're trying to tell me something, just tell me. What is it you're trying to tell me? And I said, prove to me that this is real. That was a specific request. I said, prove to me that this is real. So the next day, not knowing what day it is, but it is March 17th, I'm in a store, and I'm buying something at the cash register, and there was a lottery machine standing next to the cashier. And I just happened to glance over at the machine, and these numbers just like ram into my head. It's like, this is the numbers that are going to come out right now. And I was like, okay. I took out $1 and took a chance. And it was just as the lottery was about to end. And so I just stood there for like 10 minutes. I was like, well, I'm either going to find out that I'm crazy or there's something really going on here. So I waited, and I just stood there for 10 minutes. And the guy behind the register, I said, the results in yet? And he's like, oh, just another minute. And then finally goes, you're not going to believe this. I said, what? He said, you won. You just won $2,500. And I was like, oh, I believe it. Now, that was on March 17th. Same day. This, of course, in America, we celebrate what's known as St. Patrick's Day. You have the whole idea of it being lucky and things like that. You could look at something along those lines. But there is a deeper archetypal narrative that's playing out here. There is, and some of this is intentional use of symbolism. St. Patrick's Day was actually a holiday that was created by American Masons to celebrate the Irish heritage, the help of the Irish in the Revolutionary War. And this was a holiday they basically made for them. And that's historical fact. I'm not necessarily implying any kind of conspiracy, but this is a Masonic holiday that's just taken over, and everyone just thinks, oh, it's a day to get drunk and celebrate St. Patrick. Well, St. Patrick is known as the Green Man, and he is known for driving the snakes out of Ireland. Well, if you go back to the story of Osiris, Osiris was literally a green-skinned man. He was a green man. He battled the serpents, and he is said, if you read Plutarch, you have the idea that he died on the 17th day of the 3rd month. Now, obviously, this is a different calendar system, but again, you have this 317. So it seems that the American Masons could have made St. Patrick's Day in honor of Osiris, since a lot of American Masonry is based on there's a reverence for Egyptian mythology and esoterica. Nonetheless, what they're tapping into is a very, very profound and to me a very foundational sacred narrative, this idea of what I call the king kill, this idea that this God, this slain God, and that he dies with this specific combination of numbers. There's this numerology that continues to play out. Now, as you know, my last name is now Alan Abadessa Green, so I am in a sense also a green man. I'm having this sort of ego death experience, which we can touch on, but I have this, so it's again this kind of death of the green man, and then the fact that it was this connection to Sirius, which in an astrological sense and even a mythological sense, the Egyptians associated Sirius. If you look at the constellation Orion, that's the constellation of Osiris, and there's a connection to the planet, the star Sirius, was his wife Isis, and there's this whole narrative that they put into those stars. So the fact that it was a very specific star, a very specific mythological narrative that I'm playing out, and the fact that it was an undeniable precognitive series of dreams. And then let's take this one step further. Osiris is essentially an Egyptian version of Saturn or Kronos. This is the god of time. And the story of him is that he is chopped up into all these pieces. So what are we doing when we talk about synchronicity or precognitive dreams? We are essentially chopping up time and reordering it, or understanding time in a nonlinear fashion. Essentially, we are cutting up Osiris. Every time we have a precognitive dream, every time we have a synchronicity, this is, to me, is one of the most foundational and one of the most important sacred narratives. That this is what the book I'm currently working on is really all about. That. Just to say, as another synchronicity, in speaking to you, Philip K. Dick had an experience where he thought he was getting messages from Sirius. And I want to say very clearly for the record, I did not know that at the time of this event. So at the time I was afraid to tell anybody because I thought it was like everyone's going to think I'm crazy. And then it turns out Timothy Leary thought he was getting messages from Sirius. Philip K. Dick thought he was getting messages from Sirius. I mean, the list goes on. There's something, I'm not trying to imply necessarily that there are aliens that are, I don't know. I'm not trying to say something literal here. I'm saying there's just, I don't know. This is a repeating pattern that I think we should pay attention to.
I'm absolutely stunned at that because I've been making extensive notes as you were talking there. Because you're probably aware, I've just finished writing a biography of Philip K. Dick. And I've been going into great detail about his theophany and what in 2374 and the events of that time. And of course we already have, if you look into the experiences of Philip K. Dick, I think I'm right in saying, and I'll need to check this, but there was a series of notes he made about the manifestation of Valis within his life. And I am sure that the 17th of March is one of the statements he makes. He does 3 dates where I think he says on the 15th, the being did this, on the 16th the being did this, and on the 17th it manifested itself. Now I need to check on that, but if that is the case, there's shivers going up the back of my spine, because particularly the linkage here is peculiar. As you know, Philip K. Dick was fascinated by Sirius. He thought that a pink beam of light had actually opened up his pineal gland with a beam of light. But on top of that, when he was younger, he wrote a short story called The Eye of the Sibyl. And in The Eye of the Sibyl, he discusses these creatures from Sirius that have 3 eyes. Now, on top of that, that book then developed into the book Valis. And the Philip K. Dick scholars out there will know that in the center of the book Valis, there is this whole sequence where Horselover Fett and Philip K. Dick, the science fiction writer, go and visit a rock band called Mother Goose. And the leader of the band Mother Goose is a guy called Eric Clapton. Now, Eric Clapton, unlike what a lot of people think, it's actually based upon Eric Clapton. It's not. It's based upon David Bowie. And the reason it's based upon David Bowie is because David Bowie played the role of the alien in The Man Who Fell to Earth. So you have these symbolism and the synchronicities rolling into each other in the most phenomenal way. I was tempted to make a terrible pun there and say, of course, there was the famous American philosopher John McEnroe who made comments about this, and he said quite precisely, you can't be serious, didn't he? I'm waiting for laughter there, but clearly...
Sorry, I was muted while I was letting you talk. I didn't...
Sorry, I couldn't avoid that one. Please go on.
It's fascinating to me how integral this is. And if you study, if you study Masonic symbolism here, Albert Pike, the founder of the Scottish Rite Masonic Lodge, said Sirius was the most important symbol in the Masonic system. If you go back to Voltaire wrote a book called Micromegas. I don't know if you've ever read that. And it's basically this story about beings coming from Sirius, and Sirius and Saturn, which again, what is Saturn? Saturn is Kronos, time, Osiris, same mythological figure. So you have this serious Saturn connection, and in a story that, I mean, profoundly important story, in my opinion, that Voltaire wrote how long ago. So this is not a new thing. In a lot of ways, this is something, there's a reason that these esoteric schools place some sort of importance there. And what the true significance of that might be is not for me to say. I really don't know. I have one kind of theory, and it's purely metaphorical, is that I've been, over the last few years, I keep kind of coming back to this same idea, what I'm calling the and or both philosophy. If you can imagine the symbol of the ampersand, okay? The symbol that we use to mean both also, instead of this or that, is it, everyone's trying to figure out like this black and white dualistic approach. Well, essentially, if we try and reach a non-dualistic approach, we are coming to this both paradigm, which is very much expressed by the symbol of the ampersand. Do you know what that ampersand actually comes from? It's actually a character that's derived from the Latin. They join these two letters together to make a new character. It is the letter E and the letter T. So literally, every time we imply non-duality with the symbol of the ampersand, we are using the archetype of ET, the extraterrestrial, this idea that cosmic consciousness, or some sort of otherworldly, transcendent, heavenly intelligence is symboled by a non-dualistic this and that. And to me, that's highly profound.
Well, you had me actually rushing through my copy of Manly P. Hall's The Secret Teachings of All Ages while you were talking there to try and find references to Sirius. And I've not managed to find any, but I'm sure when I went through that book, I found lots of references to Sirius. I'm also intrigued by the symbolism of snakes that you mention here, and very much the caduceus, the Osiris, the God King, and everything else, because in my next book, Infinite Minefield, I'll be linking these symbols in a very precise way, right down rooted into DNA. So clearly we have something of fantastic power here, that I think that we're really starting to put the pieces together on it. So we've discussed in many ways the symbolism of the number 317, because you intrigued me on that, because there are people in my group that are quite fascinated by the 1111 phenomenon, and I'll just very quickly give you a very amusing little tale about 1111, in that I was being followed by 1111 for a long time. I was seeing it everywhere. Now, my logic on that is that literally it's 4 downstrokes. So, we're going to notice it because we're pattern-seeking animals, and we're used to looking at verticals and horizontals. But my wife pointed out to me one thing about the 1111 phenomenon that I hadn't spotted. And she said, you yourself have a real 1111 thing that you've not noticed. And I said, what? She said, and she took out the Dutch language edition of my first book, Is There Life After Death? Now, for some reason, the Dutch translators had decided to not call it the Dutch version of Is There Life After Death. They decided to call it Life After Life After Life. In Dutch, life after life after life translates into 11, 11, 11. Now, that to me was stunning, and it's one of those kind of coincidences that you sit back and you go, my God, that is just weird. And those are the kind of significant coincidences that you cannot explain in any shape or form by applying confirmation bias, attention bias, or anything else. It's a linguistic pun on life after life after life. So just touching on that, one of the things, again, that I'm keen to talk to you about is the concept of the suicide kings a little bit more. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Sure, and that's actually perfect. So, well, for the record, with synchronicity, I find that there's very often some sort of linguistic pun, and And very often we can do this when we cross language barriers. And now there are researchers out there, and very often not very good ones, who are trying to convince us that this is something intentional. You know, some pre-Diluvian society that came up with this basic foundational language, or some sort of masters of the universe scenario. For me, it seems like if there's some truth to that, it's that we are all, where does language come from? We're pulling something out of the collective consciousness. We're pulling something perhaps out of the collective unconsciousness. So there's this idea that when you can look around the world and see common names for common things or crossovers, it's because there's a common source, and that source doesn't have to be a literal, pre-Diluvian society. It's possible, obviously, Pangea and all that sort of stuff. That it's possible, I suppose. But there's also the idea, very literally, that where the common source is the ether, it is the unmanifested archetypes, it is this collective unconscious. So we're dipping into that very often, and when this happens, in let's say like the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, right? At what point do things start to get confused, that we can't understand each other anymore? Comes at the fall of this sort of tower. In much the same way, we can see that, say, on like 9/11, there is a very literal falling tower. The Tarot uses an archetype of the falling tower. This is something, if you go back to the story of Solomon's temple, Solomon is supposed to, there's this idea of this temple that gets destroyed, but Solomon is told, essentially, you don't build the temple with hammer and nails. And what does that mean? So, biblical scholars say, it's meant that he had the finest masons to construct this, that they didn't even need to use hammers and nails. Or you realize that it's not really talking about a physical tower. It's not a literal manifested thing. It is the temple of the mind. It is, you literally have on either side of your skull right now, you have two temples. So when we have this experience of a temple destruction, when we have an experience of what we call a king kill, the idea of, as I said about Osiris, the story of Jesus Christ, the King of Kings, that when he is killed, that is a king kill. All these sorts of things, play out in really interesting fashion. So what I'm doing with Suicide Kings is really exploring that particular archetype, going as deep as I can and showing how it plays out over and over and over and over again. So, taking examples like Jesus Christ, whose initials just happen to be JC, right? When Lincoln is killed, he is killed on Good Friday, which is the anniversary of Christ's supposed death. We have the idea of you were talking about Valis, about the 15th, 16th, and 17th. Well, what happens on March 15th? That's the Ides of March. That's when Caesar was killed. Another JC, another king kill, dying on 3/15. There is very much, in my opinion, and I go into this in the book, a sequence of dates right in the middle of March where this story plays out over and over and over. So the fact that Abraham Lincoln is killed on the anniversary of, for lack of a better term, at least the day that's celebrated that Jesus was killed. Then I go into JFK's assassination and show that the date of Osiris's death, as I said, is the 17th day of the third month, but their calendar doesn't start when ours does. So actually, the 17th day of the third month that Osiris was killed in is in the mid to late November in our modern Gregorian calendar. Well, that means that JFK died within a few days of the actual anniversary of Osiris's death. And since the Egyptian calendar actually there's some confusion that there is a margin of error of a few days that they can't quite figure out, and there's reasons for that I don't have time to go into, but there's some wiggle room as to what the actual conversion of the 17th day of that month would translate to, but we commonly do it as usually around the 18th of November. Well, JFK obviously dies a few days later, and that's possible that it's the exact day. Anyway, this story, I'm less interested in, the idea of the historical narrative and more in what it means. And to me, when we say a king kill, to me, it is an expression of an ego death. This idea of going from, your ego is the little tyrant in your brain that tells you how things are. And when you kind of kill that king, you are able to see other perspectives. Now, I hope we have enough time because I don't want to leave that there. There is an alchemical narrative that shows a king being killed, and this is central to alchemy, is the idea of a king being killed, but that king needs to be reborn. That king needs to be brought back, but they say that he's brought back full of, holiness or the light of God and all this sort of stuff. So what does this really mean? You have some dangerous gurus out there who are saying to everyone, you need to kill your ego, but that in itself is unbalanced. We don't want to just live in the id. We don't want to just, to be completely functionless. We have to find this balance, and sometimes it means that we need to kill our ego to really dive deep into the subconscious, to dive deep into this, mental sphere, but we need to come back and learn something from it and try and apply what we've learned. So it's not just that you're trying to kill the king. You have to restore him in such the right way. And again, going from a metaphor, this is the metaphor of the ego. Now, what I think is happening, and this is a sort of grand statement, but I'm hoping I can kind of show how this is happening, that since people are unconsciously playing out these archetypes as there are these assassinations and things like that, to me it seems like a sloppy and unconscious fumbling with the innate desire of Western man to break away from the rigidity of the ego. And we're not there's some part of us that knows we need to do that, and we're not exactly sure, and it's not been spelled out for us, but there's some urge within us, and we're manifesting it literally, but very often not manifesting it on the inside, which is what we really need to do. Although, I will say that you can look, in the 60s, you have all these assassinations. You have Martin Luther King being killed. You have JFK, the symbolic king of America, being killed. What's happening alongside of that? You have all these people taking LSD, right? LSD exploding on the scene, killing their egos very literally. You have all these ego death experiences, and you have mankind reaching for the moon for the first time. What is the moon in symbolism for aeons? It is the receptive, feminine, unconscious lunar realm. So here we are, killing all our kings, while we're actually having large portions of society destroying their egos, while mankind is for the first time reaching a literal manifestation of the symbol we use for the subconscious. To me, this is synchronicity at its finest, because it's showing that it's happening on every level at the same time. It's happening in the symbolic level, it's happening in a literal level, and this is all sort of happening in tandem. I hope that's a nice little package to get you started on understanding where I'm coming from on that.
That was simply incredible. That was absolutely fascinating, and there were certain things that I picked up on that. The first one is that we were talking about temples, and of course the temples in the head. And of course, as you know in my books, I'm quite fascinated by the temporal lobes, and of course temporal lobe epilepsy and the way in which people who experience temporal lobe epilepsy seem to be able to open up channels of communication to alternate universes, alternate modes of thinking, alternate dimensions, as it were. And funnily enough, our next guest on this show in July will be Patricia Awan. And Patricia Awan is an expert on the laying round of Egyptian temples. And in fact, she lives in Cairo and does a lot of research on this. So we have this link. But what really made me shiver was that I'd suddenly realized that the 15th, 16th and 17th of March do have profound significance for me. With the exception of my wife, they are the birth dates of probably the three most significant women in my life. And I'd subliminally noticed this, and it was suddenly I thought, why do I know those dates so powerfully? And it's because, for personal reasons, they resonate with me, those three dates. So we have here the idea that somehow, if our reality is being created by our consciousness, and we are creating it as we go along, which some model particle physicists will argue this is the case, including Stephen Hawking with his top-down hypothesis, which he wrote, I think, in about 2006 with a guy called Thomas Hertog. And this is the idea that the act of observation collapses the probability wave of one reality rather than another. Now, if we are influencing this, it is not at all surprising that coincidences happen to us, because this is the way it is. And I'm intrigued, again, you saying about the ego and the dissolution of the ego, and something that might be responsible for the dissolution of the ego, I would argue, is the daemon. You know, the higher self, the part of us that exists outside of time. So all these things really tie together in the most incredible way. I noticed, for instance, in one of your other interviews, you discussed the Fisher King as well, which is something, again, that has fascinated me. But I'm wondering whether we can touch on that. But very quickly, before we do that, because we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left, what I'd like you to do is to tell us a little bit about the Sync books, what the idea behind the Sync books were, who's been involved in it, and how the guys out there can actually get copies of these 2 and now potentially 3 amazing books.
Thank you. Yeah. There's so much we could touch on, right? But basically, I did the first Sync book back in 2011. What happened was, when you study synchronicity, the fact that there are all these personal, just as I can show that March 15th, 16th, 17th is significant for one reason, and Philip K. Dick can say another, you have your personal significance for it. And we see that the symbol is very explicit for you personally. This is your feminine connection. And what I'm saying is that we have the masculine ego, the feminine id. Those dates on which the ego traditionally dies are the dates you associate most closely with essentially your sacred feminine, right? The sacred feminines in your life. So it's manifesting very explicitly, but it's on a personal level. So synchronicity is so often really hard to talk about because they're personal. Sometimes they're even hard to explain without giving 20 minutes story of all the context, and then when you're done, people are like, I kind of get why that's important to you, but they don't have your set and setting, right? It's so important. So they're not going to come, everyone's going to look at the same thing and kind of come to a different appreciation of it. So I could have written a book saying this is what Alan thinks about synchronicity, but it just didn't seem honest to me. Because this would only be my interpretation of the events as I see it. So there is this huge community. A lot of them call themselves synchro mystics, which again is the term Jay Katze coined. So it has a little more of an esoteric twist on it, but not all of them do. We have people who take it from a more scientific angle, people who take it from a more of a media angle, et cetera, et cetera. So everyone's kind of studying the same thing in their own way. And I just thought, what if each of us, wrote a chapter and, hey, well, maybe we could have something. It was a very innocent suggestion I just threw out there one day, and then people started to write stuff and send it to me, and the book just snowballed. And within like 2 months, I was looking over what I had, and I said, oh my God, this is an amazing book. And I'm just blown away by it. So the first book, we had 26 authors. And then when it came out, people said, oh, why didn't you have this guy? Why didn't you have this guy? I said, well, I don't know. I couldn't reach out to everybody. Okay, you know what? Let's do another one and invite 26 different people to give their takes on it. And for the first one, it's a little more of the community that has been really, really focused on this for the last number of years. It's a pretty tight-knit community. For the second book, I reached a little wider and saw how other people who synchronicity has affected their work or has influenced their work or inspired their discoveries. And then there's also, people who take a sort of dark twist on it, that this is evidence of a Gnostic narrative that, if we talk about this repeating cycles of archetypes, well, then that's proof of some sort of matrix-like reality that some people see it as a beautiful matrix, something to understand the fingerprint of God, and some people see it as this creation of a demiurge and this thing that we're trying to escape from. So I felt like, again, to be honest, to include some of those perspectives. Some of the people who were taking the little darker Gnostic angle on it. Some people were taking the more New Agey, light approach to it. Some people were taking more of the science approach to it. So we're really covering all our bases here, and it's amazing when you see how these seemingly separate approaches overlap. That the guy who's the New Age guy, the guy who's the conspiracy guy, the guy who's the scientist, the guy who's this, who's that. And then you see, wow, if you kind of take all of them and put them side by side, you really get just a wonderful understanding of this kind of overview of how all the different ways you can look at it. I think it gives us insights into psychology and also just profound insights into the phenomenon itself that none of us is ever going to come to on our own. We need to see what other people get out of this. So to quickly say, we have 26 authors in each book, some names everyone's probably familiar with. We have Dr. Kirby Surprise in the second one, Paul Levy, Anthony Peake, we have Scott Onstott, we have Ezra Sanzerbell, Joe Alexander, Mike Cleland, Freeman, Jake, you're friends with Jason or Jake Horsley. He likes to switch his name up, what he calls himself. He's in this book as well. We have the first book has guys like Steve Wilner and Jay Kotza, Neil Kramer. And there's just, if you go to thesyncbook.com, that's SYNC. So the word SYNC book.com. And you can click on authors. You can go to everyone's websites. You can see everyone who's in it. There's lists there for podcasts where we talk about these subjects in great depth. There's lists there for where to buy the books, and just there's a ton of information on that website. And I encourage everyone to click on the authors tab, follow up with what other people are doing, the different research that's being done out there. Please grab copies of both Sync books. They're also available on Amazon.com. You can go to Amazon.com and search for the Sync book 1 and 2. But I hope people really get into this, because I feel like if you're studying time, if you're studying media, if you're studying symbols, if you're studying consciousness, this is an ingredient that everyone kind of talks about and touches on, but no one's really digging, or not to say no one. There are people who are really digging deep into this, and this is something where every time I listen to, like a Red Ice interview, everyone says, well, I had this discovery because, well, it was a weird coincidence led me to this discovery. And I'm like, well, why aren't we studying the weird coincidences that led you to that discovery? So this is where I come in, and I hope everyone checks it out and kind of sees that angle of this phenomenon.
Alan, thank you very much. We were just about to run out of time, and all I can say is absolutely wonderful, and I'm sure that Dia in the background is of the same opinion that we really need to have you back for a future hour, because, we have just touched upon the surface. So thank you very much for your involvement. The next show will be broadcast or will be recorded on the 14th of July, when our guest, as I said, will be Patricia Awan, and we'll be talking about sacred geometry and the archaeology of ancient Egypt. So please join us then, and thanks again for listening in for the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour, and we'll hope to see you next month. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.